I think that in the interest of time, we should go ahead and we can just let the latecomers in as we go along. So this afternoon session is one of these smart sessions that we talk about for us regular people. It kind of goes over our heads. The session is going to cover the important topic of supply chain resiliency and how we can practically incorporate elements of risk identification and management into the integrated planning process. We will look at how digital capabilities can support this goal, as well as what operational and strategic factors should be considered while navigating through a chaotic world. So there is no doubt that we are living in complete chaos. So Grant Swanepoel, who is currently the regional lead for global channels and alliances, Middle East and Africa of the Association for Supply Chain Management, is going to share with us some information on how to go about doing this. And feel free to pop questions in the chat, or you're more than welcome to save them for afterwards, whatever works for you. But Grant, please go ahead and take it away for us. Educate us all here.
Tanya, thank you so much. And also thank you to SAPIX and the whole SAPIX community too. It's always such a pleasure working with this great organization. And as Tanya mentioned, I focus on Africa and the Middle East for ASCM, the partnerships around this area. And a lot of the new partners and even existing partners are always asking what SAPIX is doing and how they're getting it right? So SAPIX, in terms of the community, in terms of the organization and the visibility of the company. So it's such a great honor and privilege as always to work with you. And I've actually been doing a lot of discussions recently for other partners around Africa and the Middle East, in very similar kinds of topics. And what always strikes me, whether this was before in my consulting life or doing this type of work, is that people generally are sitting with the same issues at a macro level, right? It's quite uncanny, right, to see when we do a whole analysis or look at some sort of detail within the supply chain, look at metrics, performance attributes, KPIs. Often you'll find the root causes of those really boil down to a few key things, right? And it's really interesting to see that. But also that's good because it really means that we can approach things in a very similar way in terms of how we identify and really respond to the kinds of risks that we see, right? So what I want to do today is just go through, first of all, let's just level set on planning flows, right? A lot of you already in this group here, you're very clever people, right? I think you're generally aligned with what S&OP is, what planning means. And really, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page with this, right? When we think of what is planning and what do we mean by integrated planning, then looking at this from a performance analysis perspective, right? The forward-looking as well as backward-looking. Planning, when we think of this in S&OP, and I've sat in many sales and operations planning meetings, right? Demand review, supply review, executive level meetings, where we're talking about the orders that are coming up in the next month, or we're talking about past performance. So what's really important is we look forward as well and really try and identify and understand what could be coming up and how do we deal with that. Then I want to look at the integration of risk elements into the planning function. So how do we respond to identified risk elements? There's three ways that I can give as an output here today. The one is digital enablement. So what are the tools and techniques we can use digitally to support us in the journey? The strategic response, and then the operational response as well. And for the digital one, actually, I'll be drawing upon the DCM model that ASCM has, and I think you'll find it quite interesting. Also something that you're able to go and look at yourselves, and I'll show you how to get into that and to use the model to look at your digital enablement within your supply chain. So let's just really quickly look at the planning of the supply chain, right? The first one is, why do we want to focus on planning at the very high level? So to mention a few of these, first of all, what comes up a lot is understanding and analyzing historical performance. It's connecting the different activities across the supply chain, right? And we can think of this if you look at, for example, the SCORE model: plan, source, make, deliver, return, and enable. How do we connect all these different things together through planning? We want to reduce delays. We want to look at how do we detect any issues in the supply chain and deal with them. Very important too, this is the connection of planning to the outside parts of the organization, is the relationship with our suppliers and our customers. And remember, it's not just customers, it's suppliers as well, right? Very important. And also provide the visibility to help reduce risk, give us transparency to review our blind spots. And of course, when we look at this at the end of the day, to support cost, right? Removing waste in the process and ensuring we don't repeat things that we should just be doing once, right? This is really, really key. And it may sound simple, but these are things I see very often. And I know many organizations on a monthly basis will deal with these kind of issues. One thing that's really important with planning is it's actually an iterative process, right? So like, let's look at an example of budget planning, right? So doing a budget. Typically, you see this happen once a year, right? The organization does like 27 iterations of the budget. We prop it up a little bit, you know, put in whatever numbers that the CEO wants, etc. And there's a sort of once-off budget, right? But what's important is that we then thereafter create an iterative process where every single month, or, you know, at whatever cadence we have determined is right, which is usually monthly, that we make sure we review everything again consistently, right? This could be done automated, or we can do this at a much more granular level where we know that there's specific areas in our business, certain types of products, certain types of supply chain segments in our supply chain, for example, that we need to focus on in a bit more detail. These are very important things to do consistently, right? So this is why we have S&OP. The process really forces us to actually do this and look at this again and again. As boring as it may be, something that we still need to consistently do. And the best practice in the companies out there that are doing this right are consistently doing the same process, right? Following through with that. So you'll all be very clear with this. I think this is pretty common knowledge, right? S&OP, sales and operations planning, or sales, inventory, and operations planning. Looking firstly at the portfolio of products that we have in the organization, inputting those products into the process. What is the demand going out to the customer? Therefore, what is the supply we need to support the demand? Considering things like inventory, considering things like manufacturing, lead times, cost, etc. We do the action planning piece. So what are the plans of actions we're going to take when, for example, there is a disconnect between what we want to sell and what we can be supplied? And then look at the executive level S&OP or SIOP meeting. A lot of times, you know, and I've seen this in reality as well, is many sort of the middle layer of the organization will go into that SIOP executive level meeting and ask the executives to give them the answer. But this is not really the right approach. What we should be doing is going in there with solutions or a set of solutions and allow them to choose which one is right based on all the factors that we put in together. So if you think of this like, you know, if you have small children, right, and you go to a shop, you don't give them the option to have a chocolate, right? It's either carrots or broccoli. Those are the options, right? So this is the kind of thinking we need when we go into a meeting like that. So really just to look at this from a backward-looking perspective, okay? So typical KPIs, as you can see here at the top. And I'm looking at this currently in a make-to-stock environment, right? So this could be looking at engineer to order. It could be like a make-to-order environment as well. But these would be typical KPIs that you would see looking backwards in the supply chain. So cost of goods, was the cost what we expected to pay, or how far different was it? What was the variance there? The order fulfillment, from a perfect order fulfillment perspective from the supplier. And if you look at that from the customer as well, right? Perfect order fulfillment, one of my favorite KPIs, made up of 4 components, right? On time, in full, OTIF, which you'll be very familiar with, perfect quality, and also correct documentation. Those are the 4 elements of the perfect order fulfillment. Then also looking at things like the RM or PM, so it's raw material or packaging material, days cover, the inventory health, So the inventory that we currently have, is it usable inventory? Is it in excess, or is it obsolete, or is it about to expire, for example? We have in the make function within manufacturing, return on fixed assets, and we have within deliver, looking at this from a finished goods perspective, days cover as well as inventory health as well. Okay, forecast accuracy too, always very important to look at, because we know that forecast accuracy is going to really drive the rest of the supply chain too. When we think of things like inventory policy, for example, based on the variability of demand or even the variability of supply. But what we're talking about here is really the as is, right? So this is a snapshot in time. Where are we right now with each of these KPIs, looking back at what they are? And the RCCA piece then comes next, right? Which is still very important. Root cause, what is the reason for the non-performance versus our target? And then what is the corrective action that we should be taking to support the resolution of that misaligned KPI? Okay, so this is typical what you will see in an S&OP meeting. But we also need to look going forward. Okay, and a lot of organizations are starting to do this in a better way. But looking at for example, the future material constraints from a unit or value perspective, looking at our days cover going forward, looking at our potential production constraints, looking at potential lost sales or lost profit because we might have constraints in production or in supply, for example. So these are things to look at going forward. It really is strange to me how we always, we'll look at supply, for example, from China. And no matter what, Chinese New Year always surprises us for some reason. Like, it happens every year. So this is something that we obviously can support and plan for, right? We shouldn't be surprised by things like this. And this is where the risk identification and mitigation comes in. So identifying these types of KPIs or these types of metrics, and then saying, what do we do about it, right? So let's quickly, if I may, if we follow on the same kind of track and looking at the future risk identification and mitigation, what are the sort of things that we should be looking at here? Okay, so we have kind of typical, let's call it within control elements. And then we have stuff that's sort of out of our control, okay? So this is typically broken down into 3 general areas. And this is what we think of as sustainability, right? The triple bottom line, people, profit, planet, ethical, economic, and ecological. So these are the types of risks that we can incorporate into our planning process. So if you look at the ethical risk, let's look, for example, at the one highlighted there in blue, responsible marketing and sales engagement. So we all understand things like cancel culture, right? So what are the types of marketing activities we are currently doing? What are the risks involved there? This is important to bring into our process as well. Okay, you can be really easily cut out as an organization or as a brand within a matter of days, right, in these days. So that is very important to make sure we incorporate. Geopolitical events. I can think of a few that are currently ongoing, right? But a good question you have to ask is, okay, so we cannot control necessarily the situation. Looking at Russia, looking at Ukraine. Actually, I was in a conference about a month ago in Egypt. And at that point in time, the war had just broken out. And there was a lot of discussions around the wheat situation in Egypt, because Egypt gets a huge amount of its wheat from Ukraine. So obviously there's a huge issue there. Prices have immediately gone up, and that was a massive issue for them, right? There could be other things that we need to consider here locally in South Africa that could be an impact of that, right? Then things like supply chain strategy and differentiated operating models. So how does our strategy change? What are the updates that we need to do, right, to the operating model of our supply chain, and how does that impact then the supply, the ability for us to reduce cost, etc., and keep those KPIs as good as possible. And then ecological too. So energy, water, and waste. Common things. In fact, in my area, the last 2 days, there was no water, right? So this is the reality of what we sit in. But what we're saying here is we need to be able to identify these types of issues that could occur, and then what we're going to do about them. The other one that's coming up, and we've seen this in many countries even now, is the upcoming legislation around sustainability. So how do governments ensure, or how do governments want organizations in the country to deliver the goals of, for example, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, right? These are kind of things that we're seeing coming up more and more. And let me just check, I think we might have a question or two. Okay, great. So we've got, fantastic, thanks, Brad. So let's then go into, if I just take you to the one level down. So how we've split this is, first of all, gathering risk information, and then secondly, analyzing and responding to the risk. So I want to show you how we can incorporate risk identification and management into our S&OP process. What we're assuming here is you already have a functioning S&OP process of some kind. Now we need to layer in the risk elements to that as well. So if I take you down, first of all, to this level over here. So when we look at this from a portfolio perspective, even demand side, it's identifying future potential risks across these elements, the ethical, economic, and ecological, like we saw in the previous slide. Looking at the customer side risk. So anything that could affect our ability to service customers and maintain or grow that sales channel. So even the growth aspirations of the organization, inability for us to achieve those aspirations because of any one of those high-level risks is something that we need to be cognizant of. Then we have supply side risks. So anything affecting the delivery or cost of the inbound supply. So I will show you towards the end of this presentation, we did do, ASM actually did a resiliency survey. And a lot of the elements that came out of the resiliency survey, was looking at things like, at the time, the pandemic, looking at IT issues, looking at geopolitical risks, environmental risks, etc. But really what it boils down to is, now that we have these risks occurring, we cannot get the supply that we need from the supplier, right? That's typically what it boils down to. And being able to quantify that, of course, is also very important, right? Both on the customer side and on the supplier side too. So then the question is, what can we do to respond, right? And how do we analyze, the data that we've now collected? So the first thing is definitely from a risk weighting perspective. So risk matrix is a very important tool that an organization can use. And this is where the risk matrix comes into S&OP. Now that we know what the demand side risk is, the supply side risk, what is the nature of that risk and the size of it, right? So first of all, the quantification of what does that risk mean quantified, as well as then the likelihood of that to occur. This isn't an exact science. This is not something that you're necessarily going to get right, or maybe even close to right. But not having a plan at all is even worse. So the metric that can be used here is called value at risk, which is the risk event, or the size of the risk event, multiplied by the probability of it occurring. Once we know that, we can then make decisions around which of those risks do we want to actually go ahead and model a response to. So if we look at, let's say we've identified 10 possible risks that could occur in the next 2 years. Now we want to say which of those do we want to actually explore further, understand further, and make sure that we actually model a response. So what can we do? Well, we can build scenarios. So if this happens, what will the response then be? This is almost putting in place, if I can even put it like this, we almost want to say, what would the policy then be that we want to take if this risk did occur? So if this actually happens, right, if there is an increase in the fuel price of more than 15 or 20%, what is it that we will then do, right? So we have a playbook to operate from based on that scenario. Status quo versus the event occurring, or multiple simultaneous events. So a lot of the time when we're doing scenario planning, organizations will almost look at this like one at a time. But what happens if 2 or 3 of these happen at the same time? This would mean maybe we have more of a risk of not having enough inventory, or sitting with a bigger problem within our supply chain. So this is definitely something that we want to look at doing as well. Putting in place low, mid, and high scenarios. Okay, so let's say we anticipate sales to happen at a certain level. this would be the maximum we think it could be, this would be the middle, and this will be average, and this would be what we think the lower side of that is. That's really important because now we can model various responses to that. Then quantifying the impact on metrics, cost, and profitability. So really important at the end of the day to say what the impact of this is going to be. When we look at the different scenarios, maybe we have 2 or 3 different scenarios, what is the impact of those to those specific metrics? We also have what's called a digital twin, and this is related to simulations. So let's say all the data that we've got available currently in our organization, how do we take that data and prod and change and make certain changes to that to see what the impact could potentially be, right? So it's using our real data in the system that currently exists. So you can think of it almost like we have 2 simultaneous ERP systems or MRP systems or whatever we're focusing on, and really running them simultaneously using actual data. This is really something that we would do with a digital twin. And modeling then the response, of course. So what's the key metric here? So one of the metrics that you can use, or basically this is actually 2, is upside or downside supply chain adaptability. So how quickly could we recover from an unanticipated impact on, for example, not having enough inventory, right? So let's say that's the downside. Then in terms of upside, an unanticipated increase in demand, which usually is quite a good thing, right? But how do we quickly respond to that? And what are the steps we can take to do that? What is the cost to respond to that as well when we're modeling that response, right? Because we may come out at the end of this and say, actually, the cost to do this is so high that let's rather take our chances. But let's make sure that we've at least done the analysis to prove that. And then also to test and role play the actions to be taken following a risk event. And let's record the impact of those responses. So, I mean, almost if you think of a fire drill, let's do a fire drill in our supply chain. Okay, let's say, okay, all of a sudden we don't have enough stock or the supplier cannot meet the deadline to provide us with inventory. What is it that we immediately do, right? And what would be the impact of that? This is really an important step to take. And for any of the responses that we want to put in place, because this hasn't yet all happened, right, is to really get that approval at that executive level sales and operations planning meeting. So these are all the typical responses that we can include into that S&OP cycle. So there's many ways to do this, right? And one of the things that I'd like to just share with you now is kind of how we digitize some of that. And I will draw upon the digital capabilities model that ASCM has put together. So this is what it looks like. And by the way, you can actually access this for free if you haven't already. It's dcm.ascm.org. So there's a lot of linkages of this to the SCORE model, which also, by the way, is available for free now. It wasn't before until a couple of months ago. So you can go to score.ascm.org or dcm.ascm.org. And I'm really not selling it to you. I'm really saying that it's actually a very useful tool to use, right? That if you'd like to go and have a look at that. And I think let's just check if I can access it again, because, okay, now I got kicked out because I was not there long enough. Okay. So this is something that's interesting for you to actually go and have a look at. So really what it does is take all these different nodes in the supply chain and looks at how these nodes are connected, right? To give us information on our supply chain and really act as an early warning system to support when we want to respond to a potential risk. Okay, so product development, this you will know as like NPD, right? The NPD process and bringing that in. Planning, sourcing, intelligent supply, manufacturing from smart operations, fulfillment is the deliver and return aspect, and of course the connected customer, so understanding what it is the customer is looking at and wants. Within synchronized planning, for example, we have these different areas. So these are, and many people look at this and think, okay, this must be an IT thing because it says digital. It really isn't. It's about what the connections are and the information requirements are for each of these different areas. So when we look at synchronized planning, we need to ensure that we have inventory and supply optimization, responsive demand and supply matching, demand planning and management, product lifecycle planning, supply network design, and enterprise business plan reconciliation, right? So making sure that we're following the correct business plan that we had set out to do. So these are very interesting steps that we can take. What we want to do with this is actually, there's two components. One is an input and one is an output. So in this example, what are the inputs that we need to consider when we think of inventory and supply optimization? So where do we get these inputs from? One, for example, if you look on the side there, the operations command center. Within intelligent supply, this is obviously where we're going to get a lot of information, right? To talk about inventory and supply optimization, what's happening on the procurement side, in our contract management with the suppliers, and then intelligent supply analytics to know what is it that we're getting into that from the supplier to manage our inventory better. So one thing to mention here is that we also want to understand here, what is the frequency of that communication? Okay, it could be daily, it could be at a more structured cadence, right? So maybe it's monthly or just as needed from an ad hoc perspective. And then also, what is the relationship? Is it a very strong relationship, a medium relationship, or low relationship? What we can do with this type of information is to support the supply chain with the linkages here through technology, right? Through all the different systems that we use in the supply chain. And even before that step of actually integrating everything is making sure we have the right connections and that instant communication between these different areas. So this is an example of the input. Then looking at this from an output perspective, where does information that goes from inventory and supply optimization go to? So these are the typical areas where we'd see that that obviously going and flowing to. When you think of this inventory and supply optimization piece, this could lead into optimal path selection. So how do we distribute the inventory or the products in different nodes within the supply chain, right? Where do we put it? In which warehouses do we allocate that to, for example? So this is just an example showing one of these nodes and how we can think of this linkage between the different areas in the chain. Then what I'd like to talk about, and maybe let me pause for 1 second here and just see if there's any questions on this at the moment, because I know it's probably quite a lot to start off with if you haven't seen this before. Okay.
No questions yet.
Okay, great. Then what I'd like to talk about next is looking at operational capabilities. So this is actually split into operational and strategic capabilities. So when we look at operational capabilities, we talk about things like position and prepare, sense and plan, or mitigate and respond. So this would sort of be the level 1 of operational capabilities. We could then go into more detail, sensing and planning, really taking initial actions and really understanding that and taking action, and then responding, right? Mitigating and actually responding to that. So within position and prepare, we have things like supply chain risk management maturity, end-to-end transparency, looking at the whole supply chain, risk management talent, right? Are we prepared within our talent? Do we know what we're doing? Do we have the right people making these decisions? Looking at things like liquidity and leverage ratio within the organization. So this is really looking at how we can spend our money, right, to support ourselves through managing this resilience and these risks. And then sense and plan. So this is talking about the visibility of information, risk monitoring and early warning systems. How do we engage with our suppliers? How do we do scenario planning and risk planning, right? Stress testing as well. These are things that I think we looked at a little bit within that S&OP cycle too. And then being able to mitigate and respond. So the redundancy and flexibility, for example, how do we flex our supply chains to get this right? Agility, responsiveness, velocity, so the speed at which we do it, and then safety and security. These are elements that fit within the mitigate and respond piece. So just by the way, this is part of the resiliency survey that was done about a year ago. And I will share with you at the end, but actually this is open for people to do, right? And I'd like to really offer something to the people that are here today in terms of seeing how we could look at this within your own organization as well. So if you think of the operational capabilities, these are things that are very practical that you can do, right? Things that you can do in a more short-term basis. But when we look at strategic capabilities, so how to respond to potential risks that we might incur in the future, this is kind of the area, the way that we would look at this, right? We want to either lead, build, or transform. So within LEAD, we have things like the leadership of the organization, commitments of corporate level commitment, board level engagement, being able to be aware of climate risks, and then organizational learning. So when we think of within that is things like knowledge management and how do we support that. Build is within supplier relationships or customer relationships, supply chain workforce, the internal workforce, and then of course the talent within the organization as well. Upskilling, training, and obviously attracting and ensuring we have the right talent to support the future risk that could occur. So this is important to remember, and I'll tie this in right at the end. So the next one is transform. So environmental sustainability, it's a key topic that we know is constantly on, we're always hearing about this. Circularity, and circularity doesn't just mean the sustainability piece, right? Circularity can also talk about how do we integrate different industries together even to support the use of products that maybe one doesn't need or one uses for another purpose, and we can create a circular economy like this. One of the examples that comes up a lot in circularity, which is semi-linked to product lifecycle management and also to circularity in a way, but there is an example of Philips lighting, where they basically renting out light bulbs, right, to organizations and to the companies. And those are rented out until those expire, right? So maybe it's a couple of months that the light bulbs then are, at the end of their life. The organization, Philips, would then come in and just replace those light bulbs with new ones. But you're not paying for every light bulb, you're paying almost a subscription. So they're taking the old ones back, recycling them, repurposing them, reusing them. And this is how that process typically works, right? So it's a kind of new way of thinking when we think of that. And then strategic supply chain risk mitigation at a strategic level in the organization, as well as supply chain innovation. So how do we improve those things when we think of the transformation piece of this? So let me quickly check if there's any questions on that at this point. Okay, feel free to just put your questions straight into the chat. So there's really 3 key takeaways that I'd like to leave you with, right, for this discussion today. Firstly, nothing is outside the process, right? So what I mean by that is, I'm really sorry to tell you this, but we're actually never going back to normal, right? This is it. This is what it is. And if I really think about this, from our own experience, is working within an S&OP environment for many years. I don't think I ever had 1 month that we had perfect inventory, or that the customer bought what we wanted, or that we even had a perfect supply. So there was always something. And I think what's important is that we don't panic, right? We need to anticipate and build it into the process. Everything cannot be ad hoc. And I think this is what adds a lot of cost to the process and to the plan, is when we say, oh no, we have, now we have a war. Okay, we've got to like, everything has to change. Let's order in loads of stock. Let's do this. Let's just consider the nature of the risk, what we're going to respond to, and how we're going to respond. Right. So that's really important to maintain that stability in our thinking and in the process. Right. But this requires a process that's very robust as well. Secondly, let's aim to digitize or enable the planning function through incorporation and understanding the strengths of the links and frequency of communication between the different nodes in the supply chain. So what is the information we need and where does it come from? Let's ensure that we get that on a regular basis and that we've actually mapped that out, right? I can tell you that the majority of organizations right now don't have that in a mapped out way, right? They've built up systems and tools and added on layers of things, and now we have this huge monolith of stuff, right? But really stepping back and saying, what is it that we need and where can we get that information from? Where does this go and where does it come from is a very important first step. And then, of course, thirdly, to support the organization by building the right operational and strategic capabilities to support these anticipated risks. So we need to know what the risks are. What in our business are the 10 biggest anticipated risks that we have? Then how are we supporting that operationally? So what are the key things we can do on the ground to make sure that if that were to occur, we'll be ready for it? And also strategically thinking of the more macroeconomic risks of the environment that we sit in, and how do we really respond to that? So, I mean, if I really think of this in a South African context, there's a lot of issues, right? We've got a lot of problems in the country, but a lot of those are out of our control. So the question is, if we're going to operate in this environment, what are the things that are the risks, and how do we work within this currently, right? And that's really important for us to do instead of hoping that it will just go away. So what I want to leave you with is an offer. So for the supply chain resiliency assessment and readout, there is actually already a benchmark that exists. So the benchmark was really focused on primarily, it was 308 respondents in total. And it covered consumer electronics, pharmaceutical, and the retail environment, and came out with something similar to what you see here in terms of what the type of risks expectations were for organizations looking forward into the next 12 months. This was definitely a lot of focus on pandemics because at the time this was important. So I think this will still come up as very high, but probably over time reduce in the importance that organizations see. Things that also came up a lot were cyber attacks. Interesting because actually in reality I've seen this happen a lot. A lot of organizations are being attacked right now, and you know, many companies do experience this really in a very very real way. So this is important to keep in mind. And then market changes and demand shifts. Definitely this is something that I think in the past was seen as a more long-term thing, but now we're seeing this happen much more quickly. So the change in demand, the change in technology, consumer habits, consumer likes and dislikes, and those sort of things, definitely something that's quite key now. Supply or partner bankruptcy, natural disasters, weather, geopolitical instability, labor costs, illicit trade, and then raw material scarcity as well. So if you think about these, really, a lot of these link into the supplier not being able to deliver because of these issues, or us not being able to deliver to our customer because of these issues. That's what it kind of takes the next level at. But what the offer is here is if you have 20 or more responses, those are respondents in your organization that could do the survey like this, we can actually provide you with a 1-hour readout compared to not just this piece, but also the rest of the benchmark that was created. So this was a couple of months old, but really interesting. We actually did a very similar analysis with a team in Egypt, and are currently looking at other organizations to do this with as well. So what this really gives you is a view of, okay, what do we think the current risk landscape looks like? What you can do with that then is take some of the tools and techniques that I've really briefly shared with you today, and you can use that to then see how do we support and manage those risks going forward. So please take up the offer. Please let me know if you are interested in this, if there's any organizations here that want to do this. 100% free. So I think it'll be really interesting and a nice practical take-up that this could result in. And then also please look at the DCM model as well. We can also provide as ASCM an overview of this, what it covers. There's a couple of examples in there as well, really showing sort of a case study, or there's 2 or 3 case studies that exist there too, 100% free too. But I think this is a really nice takeout for the panel here today to have a look at. So if you're interested in that, that'll be really great. And if there are any questions, please do let me know as well. And that is it for me. Thank you so much, Tanya.
Thank you, Grant. I don't know if there are any questions. Everybody's very quiet, and I think that could be not shell shock. If I just look at the content that we've talked about, and we talked about briefly about this before we started the call, about supply chain management being the best place to be in terms of career growth and development. There is no question in your mind. In fact, you need to have a crystal ball and be a mind reader. And I mean, just so one of the things that, true or not, a lot of talk, the SNOP or SIOP is often a talk shop. So companies say, no, we have it, but it's kind of like a hit and miss. It happens every so often and not at all, whatever the case is. But a lot of these things that need to be done kind of imply or assume that you have a certain amount of data that's accurate, and the data that you have in systems is accurate. So, and I don't know, so I asked this question, would all that data come from an ERP system, or would you rely on the multiple systems that you use to provide that information? And kind of bung that all together and hope to come out with some recipe. It's an awful amount of information. I mean, if you look at a big organization, for example, like a Unilever, how many suppliers do they have? You know, just for one product, for example. So it's a huge undertaking to kind of get these things on a roll, and rather daunting. So I think, and I'm sure that you will concur, that you should not run away into a panic, but kind of stop, think, and follow some sort of logical process like this. So you can unpack it, think about it, rationalize it, and start to develop a plan around that. And I really like that there's a benchmark tool, because that was one of the things that I was busy scribbling down, is some sort of benchmark tool. There's some sort of guidance that's going to give you some direction, or give you some idea of what you should be looking at in terms of addressing this risk management. So that's kind of my takeaway. It's an awful lot of stuff. And if your supply chains are working in silos, and you're not having that open communication, and that sort of thing, you're not ever going to be able to get on top of this, because you really just, more than ever, I think that there needs to be the collaboration, there needs to be trust, communication all the time. And if you couldn't get that right before, you really have a big problem if you can't get to it now. So those are my comments. You know, this is me blabbering when I'm waiting for somebody else to ask a question.
Well, just to comment on your comment, definitely, Tanya. So I think a lot of the you know, the reason, because I've been myself in these environments, right, where we're in an SNOP meetings, it ends up being boiled down to risk response all the time. Like, oh no, we don't have the stock, the supply didn't deliver, let's all rush to that. It's like, I mean, 12-year-olds playing a soccer game, right? 8-year-olds, maybe the 12-year-olds are a little bit more organized, right? But everybody's running after the ball. And I think we've almost KPI'd ourselves into that way, where we reward risk response and not risk mitigation. You know, we absolutely understand, I think everybody knows this, that we are not going to be 100% correct. And I mean, we're trying to predict the future essentially, but the nature of the environment in which we operate means that we have to be thinking about that. We cannot ignore it. We cannot ignore, even if we're sitting in South Africa, and there's a war in Ukraine, we actually cannot ignore that. What decisions will our government make? What impact is it going to be? We have to bring it up, right? And I think this is a very important step to take. And then also just to really comment on your, you know, you're absolutely right in saying this, we're assuming the basics are there, right? So I'm assuming for the purpose of this, everybody has an SNOP cycle and it's working well. That could be a wrong assumption in many organizations too, but we need to move beyond that. Let's get the basics in place, right? I remember doing a project about a year and a half ago, and the organization wanted to do IBP, right? We want to be integrated business planning. We want to do that. And in fact, they weren't even SNOP, right? They were like, weren't even understanding how to measure forecast accuracy correctly. You know, these are the sort of things that we need to really get in place very quickly so that we can move on to the next level and really optimize our supply chains even more than that. But yes, it requires the effort for sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Grant. Really useful session. Just want to echo just around what you were talking about, about measuring of the metrics within the process. And I think a typical failing that we see, metrics being, when you're measuring metrics in SNOP process, you should be looking about 20% the historic looking and 80% future looking. And if you have that kind of performance, looking at your performance from where you've got 50% of your metrics are backward looking, that's where you're going to get stuck in kind of this historic looking all the time. But maybe question from us, just around what your view is around the different time horizons when looking at risk management, right? So we're currently in a very fluctuating world at the moment. thousands of new crises happening every day. Just to, that there's definitely room for crisis management within SNOP, but also within SNOE. So maybe just like a view on the kind of the time bucket horizons to incorporate some of the stuff that you've been presenting now.
Yeah, it's a great question, Brad. And I think, I mean, typically you see from an SNOP pure time horizon perspective, 12 to 18 months is the norm, right? Or the best practice norm. But the reason why I'd also say the 12 to 18 months makes sense from a risk perspective is because we need to be able to quantify the impact of the risk, right? It's like, okay, in 4 years' time, we think this thing is going to happen. That's fine, but what do we do about that unless we can almost quantify the impact on our business? So in order for us to quantify the impact on the business, we need to have a sense of the demand and a sense of the supply, a sense of how much inventory we will have at that time. I like to put everything back into numbers at some point because it makes it practical. It's like, okay, we're missing out on 5% worth of our gross profit margin because of that issue. So this is what we can do to make up that 5%, maybe somewhere else even. But this is really not always to say that we're going to solve that problem specifically, but we know that the broader impact on the business is X, and how can we mitigate that, right? This is, I think, important, but it also depends on the nature of the risk. I mean, the war in Ukraine, COVID, things that basically caught us off guard, essentially, if we're honest, right? I mean, yes, we saw things, there was some stuff happening in China, but no one ever said, okay, gosh, this could be as big as it is. But as soon as we figured that out, it was then about anticipating, what the future few months or years could be. But I think it's very risk dependent as well.
Yeah, the other thing is also about almost the differentiation between your short term and long term, right? So I think that there's the SNOP process itself. The decisions that you're making with SNOP is slightly different to your executional decisions. You don't have the flexibility within your business to make big changes within the short-term horizon.
Yes,
and I think there is a justification almost to have a shorter-term planning cycle as well, where you're dealing with your real risk mitigating actions. I think you spoke to about corrective actions within a much shorter time horizon, possibly on a weekly cadence more than like an SNOP on a monthly cadence.
Yeah, and I think part of the risk process of identifying and looking at mitigation actions is creating a playbook for if it were to occur. So we all know, so if there's a fire in the building, right, we know we know where to go. There's a whole plan of action, follow this route, go stand here. This is what we're going to do. We're going to count everyone, whatever. But we need that kind of thing in our supply chain as well. What are the alternate suppliers that we could be looking at now? So, okay, this is the issue. Let's see the 3 different steps that we can now take to try and mitigate that. And that is in practice what we would do, but having the playbook is highly valuable. So, yeah. Great questions.
And it shouldn't be a nice to have. I think
absolutely.
That if COVID and the Ukraine issue and our unrest have taught us anything, it's not a nice to have. It's kind of like we need to prioritize making sure we've got this backup plan for when we need it. So, sorry, Alan has asked the question about has the latest SNOP work published by Dick Ling registered at all in the market? Has it been used in the markets that you're working on? So are people working with that as the
I think my response is going to be indicative of the fact that probably not, Alan, because I'm not really that familiar with it. I mean, I've heard about it, but I can't say if it's really been impacted fully. What I will say though is other ways of thinking that I know of that are almost in discussion phase, and ASCM is very much, from a thought leadership perspective, trying to incorporate a lot of this into the new models and the new score model that's coming up, etc. But looking at this from an outside in perspective a lot more. So what we've looked at from an SNOP in the past was kind of a little bit more in within the organization, right? And all the things that sit within our scope, but now almost taking those outside in approach, and registering kind of like we're talking about now, looking at things from the outside, like risks, etc., that could be incorporated into the process in the future.
Okay, Alan, I hope that answers that question. So, and I think for me, we always talk about best practice, best practice, best practice. I don't think there is any such thing anymore. We are creating the new best practices as we go along. We're going to adapt and change our businesses to this new normal that we're living in. So it's all new, and so are the best practices. So we look forward to seeing those come out from our ASTM, what's happening, what's not, what you should be doing, what you shouldn't be doing, and all those exciting things. So Grant, thank you for your time. Thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate your contribution to SAPIX, and for the time of the people that have been here this afternoon. I hope that this was valuable to you, and gave you some insight or in introspection on what it is that you need to be doing. Obviously, I must just mention the SAPIX conference. If you're not registered yet, get down there and do it, because these are the types of things that we'll be talking about in presentations, but also in those really good face-to-face conversations that we look forward to having. So I think without a further ado, thank you so much, Grant. Thank you everyone for being here, and I look forward to seeing you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya.
Thanks, everyone.